As many of you know, Tunisia was, for years after the Arab Spring revolutions broke out in Tunisia in 2011, Tunisia was looked at as the democratic model in the region, especially by outsiders who applauded its success. Those successes included the creation of a democratic, inclusive, exemplarily inclusive constitution signed onto by almost unanimously by the democratically elected parliament in 2014. They included the holding of 3 free and fair rounds of elections at the national level in the country in 2012, 2014, and 2019. They included the unleashing of a free civil society and a free media, which absolutely blossomed after the 2011 revolution. These and many more achievements were unimaginable in pre-2011 Tunisia. To be in pre-2011 Tunisia, the Tunisia of dictator Ben Ali, was, as the famous Tunisian reggae artist Ben Dirman once said, like living inside a fig. Why a fig? Because Ben Ali's party, his mono-party state that ran the country, the color of it was purple. So you would see all of these purple posters driving around Tunisia before the revolution, where Ben Ali was posing paternalistically, in these caretaker poses, as the great leader of the country. There was zero civil society, there was zero democratic contestation. Tunisia was a place of great fear, especially if you had a keen interest in discussing taboo topics like religion or politics. So when I went to Tunisia for the first time in 2007 to study Arabic on a critical languages scholarship, I thought, wow, this is a beautiful country, but it seems like nobody will discuss religion or politics with me. Obviously they wouldn't and couldn't for their personal safety. But when 2011 happened, the lid flew off the pot. These long repressed differences and debates started to percolate and to boil over. And Tunisia became a vibrant melting pot of expression, of civil society, of media critique, of young people organizing. It was an amazing place to watch. So, for all those reasons and more, it was often looked at as the shining star of democratization, organic ground-up democratization, in an otherwise, region that was otherwise benighted by the heavy hand of dictatorship. Now, to Tunisians themselves, the picture often looked quite different. And that's because whilst Tunisia's democratic transition had indeed delivered freedom of expression, which was a real good that kept a lot of people out of the prisons and the torture chambers. We shouldn't dismiss it as something that only mattered to elites. It matters to a lot of Tunisians then and now. It hadn't been as successful delivering socioeconomically for its citizens. And we know from looking at the history of not only democratization, but decolonization too. If you look at countries that were decolonizing in Africa and elsewhere in the 1950s and 60s, it was often much easier for those countries to set up somewhat inclusive or democratic forms of government than it was for them to deliver economically or to break free somehow of extractive economic and kleptocratic, highly corrupt economic situation. So Tunisia very, very much found itself in a similar state of affairs. And that lent itself to a growing sense of anger, resentment, disillusionment with the situation on the part of many Tunisians. I remember starting even in 2012, I would meet with a lot of Tunisian civil society leaders, democratic activists, who would say, man, these internationals, diplomats, technical aid experts, etc., they come here to Tunisia and they applaud us. But sometimes it can feel like they're treating us like a gifted student in a special needs classroom. They're comparing us to Egypt, and Tunisians would say things sometimes like, Egypt, is a more military ruled country. It has much higher rates of illiteracy than we have here. We want to be compared to Portugal. We want to be compared more to a country like, let's say, Croatia, or Eastern European countries after their experience of communism, let's say. So I agreed then, and now with that critique, insofar as a lot of outside observers mistakenly believed that Tunisia was in the clear. I remember one of my closest mentors, the late great comparative political scientist Alfred Steppen, who taught at Columbia University. Al and I, when we would talk about Tunisia sometimes, he would say, well, democracy has become the only game in town. Sometimes you reach a point in a country's transition where democracy becomes the only game in town. You have 2 free and fair elections. Now, as of 2019, unfortunately, Al passed away. By then, you had 3. And I remember hoping that he was right, hoping that Tunisia had hit its stride, had gotten into the clear, but things on the ground often felt very different. I'll give you guys a couple of examples. In addition to its economic woes, that prevented average citizens from tasting the fruits of the revolutionary tree, tasting the tangible goods of the revolution beyond freedom of expression. You also had a highly corrupted and corroded security sector. Tunisia, unlike many countries in the MENA region that had strong coup-prone militaries, Tunisia was to some degree lucky that it didn't. Instead of being a military coup state like Egypt, or a state where a whole kind of cloudy, blurry apparatus of a military power, like Le Pouvoir in Algeria, controlled the show. Tunisia was a police state. And it was a police state since its foundation, since its independence in 1956 from France, when its first president, Habib Bourguiba, kind of looked right, looked left at other countries in the region and said, hey, I see a lot of military coups bringing new leaders to power. I don't want these sorts of guys taking me down. He was a Sorbonne-educated lawyer. He didn't come from the military. So he said, I'm going to purposefully impoverish the military, basically, not let them vote. And instead, I'm going to counterbalance with a police state. So Tunisia, when it experienced its revolution in 2011, it had a strong police state. This security state needed reform. There was a narrow window of opportunity to reform it in 2011 and 2012, but the reform never happened for various reasons, including the fact that, an important contextual fact to remember, the political group that had been most tortured and most hunted by the security sector, the so-called Islamist Ennahda party, the center-right Ennahda party, was the party that won the most votes in the first elections in 2012. Now, this party went into a 3-party coalition with 2 secularly oriented parties. But given its baggage, the internal baggage of traumatization that was real, that happens after a campaign of torture, or a campaign of being blacklisted from employment, given that internal trauma, but also given the external suspicion of this party, which had for decades been accused of terrorism, for decades had been maligned as a dark Islamist, almost Taliban-like force of entropy and human rights violations. For decades, it had been portrayed this way by Tunisia's regimes. Given that internal trauma and that external vilification, Ennahda's hands were to some extent tied in terms of how much reform it could make. Now, we also have to be realistic here and recognize that Ennahda too wanted control over elements of Tunisia's bureaucracy, right? Ennahda too wanted to have its say over the judiciary and have its say in the Ministry of Interior. But we have to keep in mind that important context was not conducive to far-reaching reform. We also had an international context in Tunisia that didn't recognize, in my view, the importance of security sector reform early enough in Tunisia's transition, like 2011, 2012. There was almost an obsession, a single-minded fixation on the part of international actors with Ennahda. What did Ennahda really want? What is this Islamist agenda? What do these people really want? And there were a number of us, Tunisians and non-Tunisians alike, who were banging the drum about security sector reform and some of these other issues for a very long time, but very little was done on these issues. Now, inside Tunisia, you had 3 free and fair elections. And when I say free and fair elections, I don't mean the patina of democracy. That's not to say that there were no inconsistencies at all. Even in the United States and other countries, there are sometimes some inconsistencies. But externally observed free and fair elections. If any of you are interested in reading more about that, the Carter Center has done incredible work documenting all three of those elections. They and many other Tunisian and international civil society groups observed were on the ground. You had a succession of different governments elected by those elections, but also playing a seemingly never-ending game of musical chairs in Tunisian politics. You had 10 different governments over a 10-year period. And the main preoccupation of those governments was, at first, to overcome political polarization. Remember what I said about the propaganda regarding Ennahda Party. Tunisia, when it experienced its revolution in 2011, it inherited a lot of distrust between so-called secularists and so-called Islamists. I say so-called, I problematize those words, because if you really look at their positions, in the history of their positions, a lot of secularly oriented Tunisian parties and actors have not been secular in any Western definition of the term, such as wanting a separation of church and state. You know, for example, Bourguiba and Ben Ali often get characterized as secular dictators, but both of them completely monopolized the religious space from the top down, scripting Friday sermons, and not allowing freedom of religious expression. To be an imam, you had to be hired by the state. So sometimes in Tunisia, oftentimes you get into a weird situation where the secularists are more Islamist than the Islamists and vice versa. So I problematize those words a lot. Overcoming political polarization was a huge task. Ultimately, the secularists and the Islamists managed to create a pact, to create a pacted transition. After almost losing the whole transition in 2013 in the Bardo crisis, I'm not going to go into that now, a Nobel Peace Prize winning quartet got, combined with, probably more importantly, the efforts of Rashid Ghannouchi, the leader of Ennahda, and Beji Qaid Sebsi, the leader of his secular adversary, Nida Tunis. These two men, working with these Nobel Peace Prize winning civil society organizations, mediated that crisis in 2013 and 2014, and out of that was born a baby, the pacted transition. Now, the pacted transition was a political pact between the so-called secularists and Islamists, basically to mutually keep each other out of prison. The Islamists, again, I'm problematizing that term, Ennahda Party, given all that they'd experienced, all that trauma, all of that external vilification, being outsiders, being marginalized, etc., they desperately wanted to have a seat at Tunisia's political bargaining table. They were extremely afraid that they might be thrown back in prison, that history might repeat itself. So what the pact gave them, the pact with some of these old regime actors, secularly oriented actors, was a guaranteed spot at the table. And vice versa, what the pact gave some of those secularly oriented old regime actors was reassurances that they wouldn't be the victims of lustration laws that would prevent them from running elections, assurances that they wouldn't be called to the carpet as much as a lot of revolutionaries wanted for their corruption, etc. One law that was born out of this pact was the 2017 Economic Reconciliation Law, which was a really unfortunate, a deeply unfortunate piece of legislation that I wrote a lot about at the time, that basically amnestied corrupt businessmen from the Ben Ali period. And this was the signal piece of legislation that the Nida Tunis government, the secularly oriented party that had won Tunisia's second elections, post-revolutionary elections in 2014, this was the thing that they and their leader, the late President Beji Qaid Sebsi, were most obsessed with passing. I think Nida Tunis and Beji get kind of an easy rap in the collapse of Tunisia's democratic transition that we've seen recently. But the implosion of Nida Tunis as a party prevented a kind of two-party system from taking shape, where you had a secularly oriented party to run against Ennahda, and Beji Qaid Sebsi's obsession with the economic reconciliation law over and above creating a constitutional court, reforming the security services like we've talked about, delivering economically like we've talked about, really prolonged Tunisia's stasis, this painful stasis that the country seemed locked in, that wasn't delivering for average people.